What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas here. Wednesday. It's not actually Wednesday. Recording this technically on another day, but this will be released on Wednesday. This is pre-recorded. This is ready and available for everybody to tune into on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. And, of course, we'll be getting this episode uploaded on trainwrecksports.com. Very pumped up, very excited for this edition of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. My last episode, which was my UFC 241 post-fight breakdown, post-fight reaction, was very well received and was very much listened to, I guess you could say. The numbers were very good. So I greatly appreciate the love and support that I've received from the MMA fans, always and forever. I feel like the MMA fans have really been what has helped get this podcast on its feet and allowed it to kind of churn on and trail along here for the last couple of years. So very grateful to the MMA fans, UFC fans, Bellator fans, even dating back WEC Pride. You know, if you're an MMA fan, that means that you go back that far, because MMA is one of those sports that when people really started watching it, they couldn't stop. And whenever it was when they started watching it, whether it was 2015, whether it was 2005, when you start watching MMA, it's one of those sports that you just gravitate to, and there's always personalities here and there, and there's always fighters that are heavily revered by fight fans within the sport of mixed martial arts. And obviously one of those guys is Daniel Cormier, and I took a great stab at Daniel Cormier, I think, with my take on his performance versus Stipe Miocic. One where I thought that he had poked Stipe in the eye several times. It was not something that I enjoyed watching. My hubbub was not necessarily towards Daniel Cormier for the tactic that he was using, which, albeit was a dirty tactic, but tactic nonetheless, where Herb Dean should have stepped in more and done more to maybe put a stop to that, nullify that tactic by DC, because really there's no rule against that, but it should be something that the ref, keeps his eye on, because that's not acceptable, and for that fight of that magnitude, I would have hated to have seen it end in that regard, where Daniel Cormier wins that fight based on eye pokes, based on damaging the eye of Stipe Miocic or poking the eye of Stipe Miocic. I'd hate to see that. It almost happened early in the fight. But you can hear my breakdown of that and much, much more. The Nate Diaz-Pettis fight, the Romero-Costa fight. You can hear my breakdown of that on trainwrecksports.com, on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast channels, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can follow it on Spotify and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. And anytime a new episode shakes down, breaks out, you will get an alert to your phone that says, hey, this guy is on. This guy just recorded a new episode, Ryan Thomas of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. So, very thankful for that, for the fact that my podcast is on these platforms. It's been a fun transition, and it's been very fun to interact with essentially new audience members. And if you can tell, I'm pretty tired. I woke up this morning, went golfing, did so, getting better, kind of not really, kind of doing my thing, kind of not. Only time will change that, but practice makes perfect, I guess. Trust the process, in the words of Sean McDermott. More on the Buffalo Bills a little bit later. But really, I look at these fights with Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic. I always watch a fight, I have an immediate reaction, then I record my post-fight reaction, and then I take a few days. And I kind of just mellow in the results of that fight, where Stipe Miocic won via fourth round TKO. And I believe I predicted that. I believe I said in the pre-fight analysis of the show that whoever would win this fight would win it in the fourth round. I thought this would be a much more strategic, planned fight, where both guys wouldn't try to do too much in there, where both guys would try to, nullify one another, not do anything crazy, not put themselves in a susceptible position to be, knocked out. And we were almost at that point in the second round with Stipe. Daniel Cormier, I think the main story of this fight is that Daniel Cormier fought such a great fight, fought so well, fought at a high level, did everything that he needed to do in order to get to where he needed to be, but it just did not work for him. It just didn't happen, and Daniel Cormier obviously on the losing end of that fight. We always ask ourselves what's next, and in my preview to this podcast episode that I posted on my Instagram, Ryan Thomas Take, where I talked about what fight I think is next, what fight I think should be next for Daniel Cormier. But now, as I sit here, I really wonder if that is the last time we will ever see Daniel Cormier inside the octagon. And a common principle that we always forget as fight fans is not how talented a fighter is, not whether they can punch hard, whether they can kick hard, whether they can wrestle, whether they have great Brazilian jiu-jitsu, in the case of a mixed martial artist, whether they can clinch. We talk about their attributes, we talk about their skill level, but we don't talk about their family situation. We don't talk about what makes them who they are outside of the cage. And if there's one guy outside of the cage that has been a shining example of how to be, that is Daniel Cormier. So this fight flows the way that it does. Daniel Cormier winning early on, Daniel Cormier pressing the action, Daniel Cormier doing what he needed to do in order to put himself in a great situation to win that fight. Ultimately, Stipe Miocic made the championship adjustments that he needed to make in order to win the fight, and Daniel Cormier became very susceptible to that body shot, which I think Stipe exposed a little bit of something there with Daniel Cormier. The fact that DC is very weak in the body, can't take a body punch very well. Not many people can if it's on the right spot, especially if it's a liver shot. That's a shot that has always been able to stand the test of time. We go back to the Rocky movies where Rocky's firing punches at Apollo Creed's gut, trying to wear him down. Body, head. If you punch your opponent in the body enough, his hands will drop. And I think that that's something that is a tactic that's old school boxing. It's something that, for whatever reason, fighters just try to get that highlight reel knockout and they headhunt. The skull is a lot harder than the stomach. So I have always looked at it that way, as far as fighting goes. And Stipe Miocic made that adjustment. It allowed him to win the fight, but now it's almost as if that's a huge hole in DC's game that was exposed by the then former heavyweight champion and now the new and again two-time UFC heavyweight champ Stipe Miocic. So is that something that would happen again in any of DC's future fights if he does decide to come back? And that's the real question for me is not so much as who will DC fight next, but whether or not DC will come back. Daniel Cormier has been knocked out, TKO'd 2 times in the last couple years. One time it was eventually ruled a no contest against John Jones. I believe it was UFC 229. And then the next, UFC 241, Cormier, Miocic. I really look at that as a tough moment in the lives of the family of Daniel Cormier. His daughter was very upset. His son was very upset. His wife was very upset. And you have to think to yourself, at the age of 40, being a former UFC light heavyweight champ, being a former UFC heavyweight champ, a guy that did defend both titles at light heavyweight and heavyweight, I don't really know what more Daniel Cormier has to prove. And a lot of people would say, well, he never beat John Jones. Well, he fought John Jones twice. The first fight he went 25 minutes with him. The second fight didn't go his way, obviously, but he's been one of the best in the world for the last 5 to 7 years. So you got to give him credit there. And when you've been the best for that long, how do you discredit any fighter that has been the best that long or one of the best that long? It's very tough to do that. It's very tough to maintain that level of of elite fighting capability in your 30s to your 40s. Daniel Cormier now 40. What's the sense in Cormier continuing on? Who can honestly give me a justifiable reason as to why Cormier should continue on? I can actually give you that reason, though. I would love to see this Stipe versus DC rivalry, because that's what it has turned into, completed. And Daniel Cormier got the better of Stipe the first time. Stipe got the better of DC the second time. Why not do a title trilogy between Miocic and Cormier? Well, there's a few factors, underlying factors within that would make an MMA fan think that, no, that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen. Really, the main factor is Francis Ngannou. Now, Francis Ngannou had already fought for the UFC heavyweight title against Miocic during Miocic's first title run, obviously, where Miocic had title defenses over Overeem, Ngannou, and who's the next one? I'm missing one. Junior Dos Santos. So Miocic did his thing in those title defense, in those title defense fights. Oh, excuse me. Did his thing out there in those instances. And I think that who's to say that Miocic could win against Ngannou the second time? Who's to say Ngannou could win the second time? You don't know until you actually see it. But am I really bypassing Miocic versus Cormier 3 for Miocic versus Ngannou 2? I think Miocic versus Ngannou 2 is inevitable, but what type of wild goose chase could that send the heavyweight division down if Cormier and Miocic does happen and Cormier wins? Would that be Daniel's last fight? I don't know. With a belt, you get a lot more opportunities, you get a lot more angles to create a fight, a lot more matchups are available for you. Would DC ride off into the sunset with the belt and with a win? There was a chance that the UFC was not willing to take on George St. Pierre twice. They were willing to do it once, but when GSP decided he wanted to move down to 155 and fight Khabib Nurmagomedov, the UFC offices, the UFC brass said, basically, no, we're not allowing you to do that. Is that situation the same as DC's? Not necessarily, because George St. Pierre never defended the 185-pound belt, and the UFC didn't want their belt to just be tossed aside again. But Daniel Cormier really left that UFC light heavyweight title based on the fact that he had gained so much weight, was not wanting to drop back down, and there was no real players at light heavyweight in that division to take on Cormier and really push the needle, really move the needle. So that's why Cormier got this original title shot with Stipe. And I'm sorry for the yawning, guys. I'm just so tired today, but I'm working through it. I look at Cormier as a fighter that needs to be held in the regard as one of the best of all time. Whether he's a UFC light heavyweight, UFC heavyweight, just put him in there. Put him in there as one of the best to ever do it. His story is pretty remarkable. The tragedy turned triumph story of Daniel Cormier is something that I think a lot of people can take inspiration from. And he's a shining example of how fighters should act in this sport. If you want it to be called a sport, the fighters have to act the way Daniel Cormier does. And Daniel Cormier is just himself, but I would say that he's a great example for a lot of young fighters in the game today, and I think he's somebody that should be really lauded for the career that he has had. You look at some of the names that Cormier has been able to get past throughout his career, they're not bums. They are not slouches. One of them being Stipe Miocic, arguably the greatest heavyweight ever in UFC history. He's won 5 UFC heavyweight title belts that say that he is one of those guys. So I think that you see these positive messages from guys like Josh Thompson, from fighters like Max Holloway, about how Cormier is the shining example of how to be in this sport. And I think that as athletes today kind of go about their business, you look at Daniel Cormier's Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is not a newsworthy site, but I did find it interesting that Wikipedia has Daniel Cormier as a former mixed martial artist, whereas years active is 2009 to 2019. There's been no retirement yet from Daniel Cormier. So I don't know where they're getting that information. But you look at the names of these fights: Stipe Miocic, Derek Lewis, Volkan Oezdemir, John Jones, Anthony Johnson, Anderson Silva, Alexander Gustafsson, Dan Henderson, Roy Nelson, Frank Mir, Josh Barnett, Antonio Bigfoot Silva, Jeff Monson. That's really the highest profile fight of his career was in 2011, where he fought Antonio Bigfoot Silva. And I remember him being an alternate in this tournament, a fill-in, and he knocked Bigfoot out in the first round back in Cincinnati, Ohio. That was back in 2011, where Josh Barnett fought Sergey Karatanov. And then obviously Barnett versus Cormier, real big fight at that time. You had Gilbert Melendez and Josh Thompson on that card. You had Feijao versus Kyle. That was at the HP Pavilion, in San Jose, California. And then he gets his opportunity to fight in the UFC. Finally, in 2013, he fights Frank Mir, Roy Nelson, Patrick Cummins, and in short notice, he was supposed to fight Rashad Evans on that night back at UFC 170. That was in February of 2014. Dan Henderson, UFC 173. That fight, wow, he really ragdolled Dan Henderson. That was 15-0 record at that point for Cormier as he moved into the title contender status versus John Jones with that win. That gave John Jones a heated rivalry with Daniel Cormier. Cormier lost that fight, gets a short notice opportunity against Anthony Johnson after John Jones suffers some legal trouble. Then, we get the first title defense of DC's career against Alexander Gustafsson, the guy that gave John Jones more trouble than anybody. That was in 2015. Anderson Silva on short notice due to John Jones, more legal troubles for John Jones in July of 2016. Rematch with Rumble in Buffalo, New York. I was there. And something that I want to say about that experience, because my experience with UFC 210 actually intertwines with Daniel Cormier's career. When I saw Daniel Cormier at the open workouts, I also saw another good buddy of mine there, former guest on the show, Matt Perino, who writes for NYUp.com, covers the Buffalo Bills with Ryan Talbot, who will be another guest on the show, I'm sure of it, in the near future. Matt Perino was working for the UFC at the time, running the UFC.com site, did the rankings report with Forrest Griffin for a few years. And Matt Perino asked Daniel Cormier about DC's thoughts on Buffalo. And he said, I really like it here. Really cool city with good people. Reminds me of my hometown in Lafayette, Louisiana. Small town feel, but big city in parts. Something to the tune of that. And I thought he really didn't have to go into detail about Buffalo. He could have just said, yeah, great town, I love it, and brushed it off like some people do. But he went on to talk about the tour that he got of the Bills training facility, which is nowhere near as nice as it is now. A lot changes in 2 years. But just the hospitality that he showed to Buffalo and that Buffalo showed to him, that was a really cool experience, seeing all that kind of take place over the course of the open workouts on Thursday, the weigh-ins on Friday, and then fight night April 8th, 2017. That was a real massive day for me, for the show's history and everything like that, being at that event and just taking in those fights as a spectator. And then talking about those fights on the podcast was really cool. It was a lot of fun, and I'd love to see the UFC back in Buffalo. And obviously, DC has a extremely bright future in commentating for the sport. I think that if there's any guy that could end their career tomorrow or today and turn a new leaf with ease, that would be Daniel Cormier. So, me personally, I've never competed at the level that DC did, obviously, but I know what it's like to have a tough time walking away from that, knowing when you're done, knowing when your time is up, knowing when it's through. And for some people, it's at 40. For other people, it's at 21, 22, 23, where they know that they just don't have it. They don't have enough. Where Daniel Cormier always had enough. He just never knew it. And he blossomed into this flower of an MMA career that is really one of the best careers that I've ever seen. So, to Daniel Cormier, if this is the end, thank you for all the memories. Thank you for the fights. And obviously, look forward to seeing you in the broadcast booth with Joe Rogan, John Anik, or just you and John Anik, or you and Brendan Fitzgerald, whoever. I enjoy seeing you in the commentating realm of things. But if you do decide to come back, why not put your skills to the test against the guy that you were beating for 2 straight rounds at least? I thought 3 straight rounds, but Miocic did change his game plan in that 3rd round a little bit, which led to the 4th round knockout. Neither here nor there. Why not fight Stipe one more time? Try and get that belt back. Walk out with a belt wrapped around your waist in a trilogy fight victory. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. You can tune into that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. Follow me on Instagram at Ryan Thomas Take. And last but not least, take care.